Facebook. So it is my pleasure to present you Dr. Henry Tarazona. Henry has studied in China for many years. He's a bachelor. I met him when he was doing his bachelor degree. Then he continued with his master degree, and now it is his PhD that he is on. He's a Chinese great. He's a fantastic person and very enthusiastic about Chinese medicine. You can understand that he has spent um, a lot of years in China researching and taking time with different parts of Chinese culture. So, Henry, thank you very much for joining. And his lecture is going to be about the Yellow Emperor Inner Classic in everyday clinical practice.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much, Janice, for the introduction. I also want to thank everyone that joined today's Awareness Day. I want to thanks to Yanis and to the Hellenic Association. It's a really great honor to be here, actually talking about Chinese medicine. As Yanis said, I've been here for 10 years in China. I've been studying Chinese medicine and I really like Chinese medicine. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Yellow Emperor canon, okay? So for me and for many Chinese, is one of the most important book of Chinese medicine. And yeah, I mean, let's start with that, okay? We'll tell you about it. Wait a second, I will share the screen for you. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, so okay, can you see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me clear, yeah?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so as I told you today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Yellow Emperor canon, and I'm going to explain you why is that important. You know, actually here in China is an obligatory subject. You know, when we are studying the bachelor's, like all the students must study this classic, and it's the first classic that is introduced to all the Chinese students because it's really important, you know, and it's the classic of acupuncture that actually creates acupuncture in some way. You know, it actually was the book that gave the start to all the acupuncture and Chinese medicine as we know today. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit. I will give you kind of like a summary about what is about this book, and I will tell you how to use it in the clinical practice. You know, hopefully there will be more opportunities. So we will discuss in a deeper way about the topics of this book, okay? So the first thing is like, it's really important to know what is it, you know? So as I told you, it's the oldest Chinese medicine book that existed. I mean, it's believed that was wrote in the year 475 before Christ. And the first, how to say, like the first apparition of this book was by Huang Fumi. Actually, earlier in the lecture, we talked about the canon of acupuncture, and it's the same doctor, you know, so this was a doctor that actually, he compiled a lot of information of Chinese medicine posterior to his period. So we are talking about, I mean, he was living between the year 100 after Christ. So it's a really important Chinese physician, okay? So the book as we know today comes from the compilation of Huang Fumi, okay? So the Yellow Emperor actually was written before him, but actually what he did was compile it and kind of like organize the ideas again into 2 tomes, okay? So as I told you, is the foundation of the Chinese medicine. And in order to understand that foundation, is essential to know about the Chinese medicine before the book, okay? So before the book, there was no like Chinese medicine at all. I mean, there was not like a term as Chinese medicine, you know? And most of the practices that they have in China on acupuncture and Chinese medicine were based on the Transmutations and Changes book, okay? It calls Teqin in English or Yijing in Chinese. So this book was kind of like the basis and the start for all the Chinese culture, okay? So what happened and why? First of all, because in this book they introduce the changes of the Yin Yang, that is kind of like the basis of our Chinese medicine and the basis of the Chinese culture. And second of all, because after, I mean, in base of that book, later on they introduced the concept of the 5 elements that also is the basis and the core of the Chinese medicine. So we have to know that the Neijing comes actually from an older book that was the I Ching, as I just told you. Okay, so it was written more than 2,000 years ago. Okay, and as I told you just before, is divided into 2 books. Okay, so the first book is the Suwen, that is a theoretical book. So it talks about all the theory of the Chinese medicine. And actually, it's really important to understand it because all the Chinese medicine, as I told you, as we know today, is based on this book, okay? And the other part is the Ling Shu. And from this book, it's a canon, or kind of like, it gives kind of like the basis of the acupuncture. And from this acupuncture basis, there were more authors that in the future start to write about acupuncture, okay? And in total, on this book, we are going to find 162 sections. And in every section, they talk about a specific topic, okay, on Chinese medicine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about every content of the book. I will kind of like give you like a brief introduction of the book and why the importance in the practical clinic, okay? So the first thing about the contents that it's really interesting and you have to know is that this book, apart from being a medical book, is also a cosmological book, okay? So it's based also on cosmology, like Chinese cosmology that is based on the lunar calendar, okay? So Chinese culture and like from the Chinese culture since like 2,000 years ago, they've been using the lunar calendar and the cosmology as part of their culture, okay? In all their festivals and also is used in the Chinese medicine even nowadays, okay? Also, this is a book that compiles meteorology. So we're talking about the weather and the seasonal changes, okay? So like based on the lunar calendar, they were able to provide information on how might be the weather, you know, and how the weather will affect the people, okay? It's also a book based on geography. So on the China, of course, on the map of China. I will explain a little bit about later. And also it's a book of physiology and medicine, okay? So it's not only a medical book, so it compiles all these kind of topics, okay? So inside of this book, one of the main, I'm going to talk about 10 topics. I'm going to try to do it as fast as I can. So the first one, I mean, we can see that it talks about, for example, the healthcare. It introduced the 5 elements, the 5 viscera, the qi, the blood, the shen, the yin. We're also going to talk about a little bit the meridians, the pathogeny, okay, so that is the cause of the diseases, the syndromes, the diagnosis, the treatment, and Yun Qi, that is kind of like a way to predict diseases based on the lunar calendar, okay? So the first thing that is really important to understand the book is that first, this book has like an holistic point of view, okay? So as Chinese medicine has, of course. So because it's the base of Chinese medicine, it comes from this holistic point of view, okay? And the main theories that are introduced in this book comes from the Yin Yang and the 5 elements, and they all come from the Taoism tradition, okay? So the Taoism is directly related with this book, okay? As I explained you, it comes from the traditional Chinese culture and then compile and then make this book. So the question is like, who wrote this book and why they wrote this book? Actually, it calls Huan Di Neijing because Huan Di Neijing means like yellow emperor, okay? So there is a kind of like a mythological figure that calls the Huangdi, like the emperor, the yellow emperor. So it's supposed to be one of the first emperors. It's supposed to be the first emperor of China, the one that unified whole China, and he was kind of like a hero, you know? So a lot of experts, they actually think that they just call the book like this in order for people to give him approval, you know? So if they were thinking that the Huangdi actually wrote the book, like the Yellow Emperor wrote the book, people will give him approval to the book, okay? So actually, of course, the Huangdi didn't wrote the book, and it's just kind of like a certain amount of dialogues. So it's the Huangdi talking with this disciple that is a doctor, another doctor, and they're asking about some questions, and the book is just about asking, and and responding these questions, and they will talk about different topics as we are going to see as we follow, okay? So I will introduce you kind of like the main chapters of the Suwen, that is the first part of the book. As I told you, is like the theoretical part of the book. So the first thing you have to know, and why it's important to understand it, I will really make emphasize on that later, okay? So the first thing that we see is like the first chapters of the book are based on thinking about the healthcare, okay? So they talk about healthcare of the people, and they try to explain the human physiology, you know? Even though, you know, the book was written 2,000 years ago, and like right now with modern science and like the development and everything, they were actually really accurate. I will give you some examples. It's really interesting to see how accurate actually they were at the time. And of course, they didn't have the technology that we have today on science, you know, doing anatomy and everything, but they were really close to that kind of anatomy. You know, they didn't need that tools in order to know that the body works in certain way, okay? So in the first chapter, we can see, for example, examples describing, you know, why people get sick, you know, like why people, like nowadays, I mean, they talk at that time like nowadays people, you know, they were talking about the nowadays people, they get sick even easier than before, you know, they used to think that people in ancient times, they live like longer, okay? And then in the book, they try to talk about a little bit of this thing. So it's kind of like talking about the healthcare. So it kind of like, the book is kind of like telling us that we have to live our lives according to the changes of Yin Yang, you know? So it means that you have to live according to the changes of the universe, you know, because as I told you, the Chinese medicine is a holistic concept. So everything that surrounds us is going to affect us. So from the weather, from everything, from your emotions, from the pathogens that are in the air, they will affect you, okay? So you have to live according to the changes, okay? So for example, if today is cold, you have to wear a jacket, you know? So it's kind of like they were emphasizing that people have to be aware of these changes of yin yang, okay? There are things like the other way to keep health in ancient times, like so people will be healthy, is like by knowing the weather. So they also emphasize again, you know, knowing the weather and numerology. When I say numerology, in this case, it's kind of like a rough translation, but actually what it means is like according to the lunar calendar, knowing which times of the year is going to be more cold or which times of the year is going to be too hot. So you can take preventions, you know, so in order to not get sick, okay? Also, they make emphasize on eating in a good way, like having like really good habits, like a good diet, because they realize if people don't have a good diet, they will also feel ill, you know? Also, they emphasize on working, resting, and sexual relations, because, but I will explain you a little bit later about the sexual relation things. And then finally, they will also emphasize on the overwork, you know, people cannot overwork or they will get sick, okay? So it's really interesting to see that on that time, they already were doing comparisons of how to have a good life, you know, like how to have a good, like healthcare, you know, and how to live longer. So the problem is like, I mean, if you compare the time, you know, the period of the time of this, when this book was published, we can notice that, for example, like 2,000 years ago in Europe was a different environment, you know, like China at that time was kind of like a great empire, you know, and people have like, they were wealthy, you know, so they have like conditions to start to research on this kind of scientific, I mean, I call it scientific, but on this kind of like knowledge, okay? So also something that is really interesting that I was talking to you about is that in this book also they introduce the human physiology, you know, and then actually, as I told you, it's really close to what we know right now, like in nowadays. So it's really interesting to know. And actually this really helps for the like clinical practice, because once you know why people, for example, get old or why people cannot have kids anymore, from, of course, from the Chinese point of view, it will make a lot of sense, you know. So when you treat a patient and you know their age, you will kind of know what kind of diseases these patients are going to be more propense to have, okay? So I'm going to give you some examples. So the thing is like this. When we talk about physiology of the body, and they actually emphasize on the reproduction. So for them, being like on a reproductive period was actually something really good. And then they think that when you stop to have the ability to reproduce yourself, then at that time your body was already kind of like not in a good shape. Okay, so and then they discovered that, I mean, in the theory, they discovered that everything was related with the kidney and the chi. Okay, and they divided this period of time, or like this physiology, by genders. Okay, so actually this is really interesting because they were saying that on males, these changes will happen every 8 years. Okay, so there will be physiological changes that will really impact their health. Okay, so for the females will be 7 years, and for the males will be 8 years. Therefore, males will get older, like not as soon as the woman. Okay, so what I mean with this is like for them, for the males, I mean in this case for the males, they when they get to 64 years old, they will be old, you know, like, so they will not be able to reproduce itself. Okay, and for the females, will be 49 years. Okay, so when the females get to 49 years, for them was kind of like the time where they couldn't have kids anymore, so their chi was a little bit low, so their body will get some diseases. Okay, so it's really interesting to know that, because I mean, if we know nowadays in modern science, they were kind of like accurate talking about, for example, menopause. You know, it's kind of around that age, you know, like 49, 50 on women. And then it's really important, like the theory, you know, they introduce a lot of theory here. They introduce, for example, the kidneys, like the chi kidneys. They also introduce that the yang meridians on women. So it's really interesting to see, like, for example, the distinction. They make a really clear and specific distinction of the physiology of males and females. You know, it's different, and it's really important to know this, because if you're in the practice, you know, and if you're treating your patients, and then you think, for example, you're treating a woman, but you treat her as she's a male, then maybe the results are not going to be that good, you know, because for the Asians and in the basis of the Chinese medicine, the males are based on the kidney, you know, on the kidney chi. So it's really important for males to kind of like keep their yang energy, okay? So like from the kidneys. And from the woman is really important, like the yang meridians when we talk about the stomach, you know, so in that case it's related with the blood. So it's really important for the practice, you know, and will help you to really have like a wider view of Chinese medicine when you treat patients, okay? Other important thing, as I was telling you before, is about the 4 seasons, you know? So it's really interesting how Chinese people, they notice that like during different stages of the year will affect people, okay? So depending on which season they were, they will have certain type of diseases, you know? So this is really important because, I mean, they realized that actually the seasons, they were kind of like a cycle, you know? So every year was repeating like a cycle. And they realized that on every season, one organ will be more affected than the other organs, you know, and they discovered that actually there is patterns in nature. So there is nothing that is randomized in nature, and that's something really, really interesting that Chinese medicine actually brought to us, you know. So this is the changes of the yin yang, you know. So actually everything goes into an equilibrium, you know, and there is nothing random, and everything happens and repeats in like indefinite cycles, you know. So in this case, it's really important to know these kind of cycles and know, for example, how the seasons are going to affect our organs, because if we know this, also in the practice, we will be able to treat the patients, you know. So for example, I will give you a really easy example. So if we have a patient on winter, in my experience, I always tell you about my experience. So for example, if we're a patient in winter, it doesn't matter what kind of patient, we always will think about diseases related with the kidney or maybe from yang deficiency. So it will help us to give us like a wider prospect of how to treat the patients, and maybe try to see if we can treat that kind of diseases like during that type of period, you know, because it's easier for people to get these kind of diseases, like related kidney diseases, on this season, you know. So we can only focus on the season and try to treat the patients, okay? So as I told you, it's a holistic concept like the whole Chinese medicine. And what actually in the book they told us, like as I told you, they emphasize on healthcare. They always emphasize that on summer and spring you should fortify the yang, and in winter and fall you should fortify the yin. So it's the same example, it's like the changes of yin and yang, and you should be careful about it. So the second thing to talk about is that in this book they introduce the yin yang. That is really interesting concept, and I'm sure most of you already studied. But what is interesting about the yin yang and knowing like what they told about the book is like it's really useful for the clinical practice. Okay, so in the book they introduce they give the definition of what is yin yang. What is the main characteristics, what are the functions, what kind of disease we can get related with the yin yang. And this is one of the bases of acupuncture. Like a lot of, if you read all the acupuncture tests, like the textbooks, the main point of acupuncture is to kind of like regulate the yin yang, the qi and the blood. So, it's like everything is related with this. So a really good example where we can see this, and also according to the book, is like, for example, on the parts of the body, so for example, our arms are more yang than, I don't know, like our lower limbs, or head is more yang than our lower limbs, and depending on the position of the body, it will have like a representation of yin and yang, okay? And from this representation of yin yang, it comes the treatment. So this is the really important thing that they introduced from this book. So they took two concepts from Asian culture that were the yin yang and the 5 elements, and from there they became like a treatment. Okay, so they became a system. So from this system, we have the Chinese medicine that talks about 5 elements, but these 5 elements also are in constant relationship with the yin yang. Okay, and from here also, as I told you, it comes the acupuncture. Okay, so it's the acupuncture and the 5 elements. They come from the 5 flavors, like the Chinese medicine, comes from the changes of the yin yang. Okay, and to talk a little bit about these kind of changes, they also realize that when the yin yang affects our body, we will have if you have some imbalance of this yin yang, it will create diseases. Okay, so where there is no balance, it will create diseases. And at that time, they also thought about how the diseases were created, so they think that they come from the external pathogens and the emotions, so all these things, according to them, will affect the body, and then you will get diseases, so the external pathogens, they come from the changes of nature, and the emotions, they come from inside. Okay, so from inside of you, so everything is affecting the human body. And I'm sure like most of you, they saw a chart similar to this, and maybe thought when you were in the class, like, what is this, like from where it comes from, and actually it's really interesting because in the book they introduce this chart, so you can really see why, for example, the directions or the sounds, or I don't know, like the orifice or the colors are related with the 5 elements, and why they are related with the organs and yin yang. And this is like the most important thing for the practice, if you cannot really make a distinction between the 5 elements and how they are connected with the yin yang and the organs and the diseases you have, then it's going to be really hard to treat patients, so it's really important to have all these concepts clear, and then when you go to the practice, you will know like what to do and how to treat the patients. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways we get the diseases, so as I was telling you, we get the diseases from outside. So, the nature have all these changes, and from these changes of yin yang, they describe 6 types of pathogens. Okay, so the 6 types of pathogens: we have the wind, we have the fire, we have the dryness, okay, we have the cold, and the dampness. So they realized that these kind of pathogens, as they call, they were also changes from nature that will affect our bodies. Okay, so it will come from outside. So this will be one of the reasons why we get sick, And the second thing will be the emotions. So they also realize that the emotions will create a big impact on the body. So every time, and this is really important because every time you treat a patient, and sometimes we forgot about it, we just see the patient maybe sometimes as a Western, I don't know, like as a Western way to see the patients. And we think, oh, the patient has pain, I don't know, in his arm, but we don't really think about the whole thing, why he got the pain, maybe because of an external pathogen, or maybe because the emotions, sometimes also emotions are related with a lot of diseases, and we don't really make emphasis on that, and it's really good for the practice, when you realize that actually emotions are like should be really related, you will get really good results in the practice. So if you notice, like in all the books of internal medicine in China, all the diseases we talk in Chinese medicine, the first reason they give to get these diseases is the emotions. They always say it's because of the 7 emotions. And it's really interesting, because they say it here in China, but not a lot of doctors apply this kind of knowledge, okay? So, but it's really important to know in order to treat patients. It will help you a lot. And I mean, I guess in another opportunity, if we have the time, we can talk a little bit more about it, okay? I only have like 3 minutes, so I'm going to try to be as fast as I can, because I think the time is not going to be enough. I am trying to do my best to like explain you what I have to for you, okay? So as I told you, in the acupuncture, it's really interesting if we understand all these concepts of yin yang and the 5 elements and the viscera, because when you understand really where the Chinese medicine comes from, because the Chinese medicine actually comes from the culture, when you really understand the Chinese culture and you really understand the way of thinking, that is not based on the logic. I mean, it's not based on the Western logic, it's a different type of logic. It's a different thing. And when you realize that actually they're how to say it, like their philosophy is based on the culture, then it will make a lot of sense in your mind, So for example, a really good way to see it is, for example, our acupuncture practice. A lot of people here, I guess, practice more acupuncture than herbs. So, I mean, there is also some examples inside the book. So how to treat patients, like, for example, from the left side. So if someone has like a disease from left side, you can treat the right side, or from up to down. As the example I give you just in the picture, up below, So as I told you, if we as doctor, we fail to identify the main source of the disease, we will have the patients, okay? Or maybe we will not really treat the patients correctly, okay? So it's really important to know all these changes and know all the relationship it has between them, okay? Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about also what else they introduce in the book, but this is going to be kind of like a little bit faster because we don't have the time. So also in this book, we talk about the viscera. They talk about the 5 organs and why of the 5 organs, because sometimes we study something, but we don't know really the reason, When I was here in China, I remember the first time I came, I have a lot of questions in my mind, I came from a Western like education. And for me, finding why was really important, Here they sometimes just give you like, they tell you, you have to memorize it like that, and it's like that. But actually, man, finding the why, it's really important because it will solve all the problems you have, like all the questions you have. And here is really important, like to know why, like why the 5 viscera, or where these concepts came from. Because sometimes also as Chinese doctors, as acupuncturists, maybe we study the 5 organs, and when we study acupuncture, but maybe we just give it for granted, we don't really think about it, where these 5 organs came, like why, I don't know, why not the large intestine was like a main organ, why it was not, like we never thought about it, but actually in this book, they introduce the reasons, of this, and they talk about their function. They introduce the viscera, and the extraordinary organs, So in the Chinese medicine, there is a concept that calls the extraordinary organs. And as I told you, in another opportunity, we can talk about it. And something that is really important that they introduce also in this book, was the concept of the acquired essence. Okay, so it's the essence that you will get after you're born. So it is really important, it's really interesting, for example, this kind of concept, because nowadays we call it immunological system, from my point of view. So they were actually at that time, they were smart enough to know that you have to have that healthcare, and that actually will boost your chi, that in some ways your immune system, and that will help you to prevent from a lot of diseases. And also from this time, they introduce another concept that is the essence that you receive from the anterior heaven, that it's like that in some way calls genetics, So it's really interesting to see this science combined with the Chinese medicine in some way, So as I was telling you at the beginning, Chinese medicine actually it's really accurate, you know, in a lot of concepts that maybe Western people started to think actually really later on in time, you know, and we are talking here about 2000 years ago. So it's really important to know about the book, and the book will give you a lot of information and will answer a lot of questions, okay? And to finish, I mean, I'm just going to talk about 1 minute more. Sorry to make it a little bit longer. Maybe I talk too much. And I mean, to finish, I'm just going to introduce you another 2 chapters of the book. Of course, it's not all. I mean, there is a lot of to cover. It's really interesting. But also in this book, they introduce, like, apart from these concepts of Yin and Yang, they introduce the concept of the blood and the Qi, okay? And also talk about a little bit about the Jing and the Shen. And it's really interesting because, for example, Doctor, I forgot his name, sorry. I mean, the doctor was just talking about the cancer. It's really interesting because he was talking about actually the spirit, you know, he was talking about the Shen and how the Shen, actually, it's really important to treat diseases. And actually what he said was really interesting. Like, he can see the patient's eyes, he saw the fear, you know, and the time we were talking about the emotions, as I was just explaining you, that is really important to take into account that the emotions can actually affect the body. And, you know, like how, for example, the spirit can be related with mental diseases in the practical clinic. It's really interesting topic, but I mean, I cannot really talk about it because it's like, you know, maybe like an hour lecture here. And I mean, and finally, like, to tell you about a little bit about like where all the diseases come from, you know. So this is kind of like the question they try to solve in this book. And it's really interesting because from this book, I mean, the answer of this book is where all the Chinese medicine is based. Okay, it's like all the Chinese medicine and like good doctors of Chinese medicine here in China, they base on this, you know, like where, like on the finding the pathogenia. Okay, so where the Chinese, like the diseases came from, like the origin of the diseases. And actually they talk about the 19 pathogens, you know, and it's really interesting talking about these pathogens because at the end you can know that actually, as I was telling you, nothing is random in Chinese medicine. Everything has a reason, and it actually is a cycle, you know? So it's like these changes of yin yang, and you can see how they are related with the organs, how are related with your like parts of your body, like it depends on which region you get these kind of things. So it will create some diseases, you know, so nothing is random. So for example, they were saying that, for example, if someone has vertigo or feels kind of like blurry vision, it will be related with liver, you know. So they talk about these 19 pathogenesis that is really important. And in the practice, this is kind of like a key point, you know, for every acupuncturist or every Chinese medicine. They must know this because really is the base, and to treat any type of patient, like if you go to look back, it will be here. So it's really interesting actually how they actually guide you and tell you like how it's going to be. So for example, people that use herbs or people that use acupuncture, for example, to treating, I don't know, like vomit or for example, asthma, it just tells you that actually is related with your qi going up, you know, so you know that you have to put the qi down, and you can use some herbs as like, for example, chai hu or shangma, or you can use some acupuncture points like neiguan or chongguan. So it's really important, it's really interesting because it will give you like a way to treat people, and it will give you that boost that you need, you know, to kind of like widen your practice, okay? So I really hope you enjoy this 30 minutes. Like I kind of like talk maybe too much. I hope you like it. And yeah, if you are interested, maybe we will have more opportunities in the future to discuss about it. And I really like it. No, thank you, Janice. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Henry. Dr. Henry Tarazona is a practitioner of Chinese medicine. He's in China at the moment, as I told you. And he did the impossible to try to summarize the Yellow Emperor in half an hour. Of course, it's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I just went to the main topics. Yeah, yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
And thank you. Henry, I want to thank you because you are running this course for the Yellow Emperor, because it's a very important book, and with a huge wealth of knowledge, as you said, not only for medicine, but also for living healthy. So if people want to contact you, they can always do that through the email you see here on your on this side. So it's info@ccm.gr, and they can subscribe to your class, which is going to be online since you are in China.
Yes,
So
yes, thank you.
thank you again for joining. And now it's time to welcome